Hello everyone, my name is Ian, you're watching Big Rock Moto. Thank you so much for tuning in today. So whether you're new to the adventure bike scene or maybe you already own an adventure bike or a dual sport bike, one of the most common dilemmas that you face is, do you buy a full-size adventure bike or do you buy a mid-size adventure bike? Now before we go any further, let's try to at least form some kind of definition of what is an adventure bike. I know there's a lot of opinions about that, but in my opinion, an adventure bike should meet some of the following criteria. An adventure bike needs to have some level of off-road capability, right? Obviously, otherwise it would just be a street bike. It also needs to be suitable for long distances or long journeys, so it needs to have some level of comfort and ability to take you on those really long distance trips. It also needs to be able to carry things like luggage and a passenger. In my opinion, an adventure bike needs to be able to travel at sustained highway speeds of 65 miles an hour or 110 kilometers per hour for sustained longer periods of time without making you extremely fatigued or without totally wearing out the engine, wearing out the motorcycle quickly at those speeds. And my last criteria for an adventure bike is it needs to be able to go at least 150 miles with the fuel that it carries on board. Now, how do we classify adventure bikes? So while there's no official classification, I'm going to propose that we classify adventure bikes into the following three categories, and I hope this kind of catches on. I think people are kind of already using this, it's just nothing's really in writing or official about this. So I'm going to say that we should call small adventure bikes anything between 0 and 499 cc. So this would include bikes like the Honda CRF 300L Rally, the Royal Enfield Himalayan, motorcycles like that. The next category is going to be mid-size adventure bikes. So that's going to be anything between 500cc and 999cc. So that's going to include, at the small end, maybe something like a Honda CB500X would be right on the border between a mid-size and a small adventure bike. But it's definitely going to include bikes like this Yamaha Tenere 700, bikes like the KTM 890 Adventure, the Triumph Tiger 900, and things like that. The next category, the third and final category, is going to be full-size adventure bikes. So anything 1000 cc and up. So it's going to be bikes like this R1250 GS Adventure. It's going to be something like a Honda Africa Twin 1100, a KTM 1290 Adventure, motorcycles of those sizes. Now, I get messages and emails, social media messages from people all the time, and one of the most common questions I get is, it's usually somebody trying to decide between two different adventure bikes and what's going to be the best for their style of riding. They want to do some off-roading, they want to do some highway, and they really don't want to compromise in any area. Now, of course, everything is a compromise. You always have to choose what set of compromises you like. So for example, this R1250 GSA and this Tenere 700 are pretty different motorcycles, but in the end they achieve a lot of the same mission. They will both take you on adventure-style traveling trips. They just go about it very, very differently. Now, of course, there's really no black and white answer to say that a mid-size bike is better or a full-size bike is better. You're going to have to decide based on how you want to use the bike. But in order to help you make this decision, I needed to come up with something just to help you to look at, to help decide which class of bike might be right for you. So I've broken this down, and in my opinion, there are really 8 different ways that these two classes, the full-size and the mid-size bikes, are different. And those 8 ways are the following. Now, we're going to break these down in a minute, but let me list these off first so you know what we're going to be talking about. So the 8 different categories are going to be price, weight, carrying capacity, power, and then the on-road section breaks into 2 components. The first on-road section is going to be urban riding or B roads or back roads. The second on-road section is going to be highway riding. The off-road section also breaks into 2 categories. The first is going to be gravel roads, and the second off-road category is going to be technical or difficult off-roading. So the first category is price. Now, it's pretty obvious that a full-size adventure bike in most cases is going to be more expensive to purchase, but also probably more expensive to insure, to maintain, to service, and just the running costs are going to be a little bit higher on the full-size bike as compared to the mid-size bike. So if you're really a budget-oriented person, in most cases you're going to be better off looking at the mid-size adventure bikes. So the win here definitely goes to the mid-size adventure bike in terms of price. The second category is weight. Now there's so much argument out there about what motorcycles should weigh, why aren't motorcycles heavier, and let me just give you some moment of truth here. Adventure bikes are always going to be on the heavier end. Try to give some sympathy to the manufacturers about this. I mean, look at what they have to include on these motorcycles to make them in a way that you're going to want to buy them. They have to be comfortable, they have to be powerful, they have to have a lot of technology and features in many cases. They have to be able to take passengers. You got to have good lighting, you got to have a large fuel range, you got to have great suspension. You want tubeless spoke wheels, which add weight. So again, it's very difficult. Oh, and also you want twin cylinder engines because they're smoother than singles, right? So all these things add weight. When I look at all the data, generally mid-sized bikes are coming in between that 400 to 500 pound mark, or that maybe 180 to 220 kilogram mark. And most of the full-size adventure bikes are going to start around that 500 pound or 220 kilogram mark and go up from there. Those are the general breakdowns. So when is weight good and when is it bad? Well, weight usually works against you in most situations, and here's what I mean. Weight makes a motorcycle typically harder to maneuver, it makes it harder to stop, it makes it slower to accelerate, it makes it more difficult to ride through technical off-roading terrain, harder to push in and out of a parking spot, harder to lift in general. So weight works against you in many different ways, and lighter is generally better when it comes to motorcycles and generally when it comes to cars too. However, there's a couple things that people don't realize about weight where weight can actually be good. So one of the things I love about this R1250 GS, and one of the reasons that I have one in my personal stable of bikes, is that at high speeds, like 70, 80 miles an hour, or like 120 kilometers an hour and above, the motorcycle is very, very stable. It's not affected by crosswinds. It's not affected by turbulence caused by trucks and trailers going by me or when I'm passing those vehicles. It's just very, very steady and gives you a confident feeling when you're touring at those higher speeds and those adverse conditions. So that's maybe one of the only areas where the weight tends to be in your favor. So the win in the weight category definitely goes to the mid-size adventure bike. All right, so the next criteria that you want to look at when making this decision is the carrying capacity. Well, what do I mean by carrying capacity? Well, what I mean is how much weight and stuff can you put on the motorcycle before it really starts to affect the performance and the handling and safety of the bike. So here's what I mean. Let's take this R1250 GS just as an example because it's right here next to me. You can load this thing up with a lot of camping gear, luggage, a passenger, and because it has things like electronic suspension that automatically adjusts, but also because it has a big, strong chassis, a strong frame, and it's also heavier to begin with, the motorcycle is less affected by adding a lot of weight to it. On the other hand, if you put the same amount of weight on something like this Tenere 700, the suspension is going to sag way down, it's going to affect the handling, you're going to have not quite enough braking capacity, your power is going to be a bit more limited. That's one thing I didn't talk about, the power, right? So when you have a lot of weight, you want a little bit more power to pass cars at high speeds. And so in terms of carrying capacity, and you can even verify this by looking at the actual payload capacity of motorcycles, which manufacturers do have to list, something like a full-size adventure bike is generally going to win out as compared to the mid-size adventure bike. So for carrying capacity, that win goes here to the full-size adventure. So the next category we need to talk about is horsepower, right? Power and torque. So there's a few different ways that this is going to come into play. Some of you just like to have a lot of power, you enjoy the feeling of the acceleration, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what you really need to look at is the power to weight ratio. So what I mean by that is, yes, you can have a lot of horsepower, but if that bike is very, very heavy, it only has so many horsepower per pound to move that weight. If you take the same amount of horsepower and put that in a lighter motorcycle, that lighter motorcycle, all things else being equal, is going to be faster and more fun to ride. Now, do you need a lot of horsepower? Well, for most people, probably not. The situations where power is going to be beneficial for you is if you're going to be carrying a lot of gear, if you're going to be carrying a passenger, if you want to travel at those high sustained speeds, or if you just are an adrenaline junkie and like the feeling of acceleration. This also really depends on where you live, because I know many countries in the world, there's not really places where you have the opportunity to travel at high speeds for any sort of sustained period of time. Maybe smaller countries or smaller roads with lower speed limits or rougher terrain. Here in the Western USA, we have a lot of freeways that are 80-mile-per-hour speed limits. So, you know, the smaller motorcycles kind of feel a little bit left behind if you're cruising along at 65 or 70 and you have semi-trucks and RVs going by you at 80 to 90 miles per hour. So some people in other countries are confused why Americans like such big engines in their motorcycles. It's just because we have huge distances between cities, we have high speed limits, and we just travel at those higher speeds. So in terms of power, the win definitely goes to the full-size adventure bikes. So I mentioned we're going to break the on-road component into two different parts. So let's start with the urban pavement or the back roads or twisty roads or whatever you want to call it. So for that category of paved riding, in general, the smaller size and the lower weight and the increased maneuverability and just the smaller form factor of the mid-size adventure bike is going to be a bit more advantageous, a bit easier to handle when you're coming to a stop, dealing with traffic, filtering lanes, parking, also handling on tight twisty roads in general is a little bit better on the mid-size bikes just because they're smaller and lighter and more flickable. So in this category, I would definitely give the win to the mid-size adventure bike. Now the second category of highway riding, which I've made its own category here, is going to be the highway riding. Now we've already kind of beat this to death talking about it in previous sections, but if you're doing a lot of sustained travel above 70 miles per hour or above about 110 kilometers per hour for long periods of time, the power and the stability and everything of the larger full-size adventure bike class is generally going to be a big advantage for you. So for highway riding, for high-speed riding, the full-size bike definitely has to win that category. Now I also mentioned that we're going to break the off-road component into two different sections. So the first off-road component that I want to look at is going to be what I call like gravel road riding. So a lot of you know what I mean, but what I really mean is like graded or maintained non-paved surfaces. So things like decomposed granite or gravel or just roads that, what I like to say is these are Subaru roads, right? No offense to Subaru owners, but if you can take a Subaru Outback or Subaru Forester on that kind of road, then I figured that's kind of an easy dirt road and it's not something that like you need a dirt bike for. Then in that case, there's really not too huge of a difference between the full-size or the mid-size adventure bike. Both of these bikes can deal with that type of off-road terrain or that non-paved surface. If you know that's all you're going to do, then I would have to give this category a tie between the two bikes. So the second category of off-road is going to be technical off-roading. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's probably some official way to define it, but it's kind of hard to do that. But what I mean is if you can't take like a Subaru Forester on this road, so if you have big washouts, big ruts where you need ground clearance, if you have loose rocks and boulders, deep sand, mud, snow, ice, huge undulations that you have to navigate, steep hills, steep loose hills, up or down. Or maybe we're talking about, double track or even single track riding at the extreme level. So for this kind of terrain, this is where the full-size adventure bikes in general really start to show their weakness as compared to the smaller adventure bikes. Because now I know there's all these videos with the professional riders like going crazy on these full-size bikes on that type of terrain, but that's just social media hype and clickbait, and that's not reality for the average person. There's no way the average person like myself, or probably like you watching, can take something like a GS and ride it in that fashion. It's just not going to happen. So as you start to get hung up in that type of terrain, you get stuck in rocks, you get stuck on a steep hill, you get stuck in the sand, you drop your bike, you have to push and pull your bike around. That's where the weight and the bulk of these larger adventure bikes is a huge detriment to that kind of riding. It makes that kind of riding a lot more tiring, and you really have to be so concentrated not to make a mistake, because when you make a mistake on a bike like this, it really bites you in the behind. With a mid-size adventure bike, you have a bit more flexibility there. It rides a little bit more like a dirt bike or or an off-road bike, although it's not a dirt bike and don't think that it is. But in general, they're a bit easier to handle when the going gets really, really rough and sketchy. The lighter weight and a smaller size just makes it less scary, less intimidating, makes the motorcycle easier to recover, and you're just going to have a more pleasant experience in those really, really rough kind of off-road situations with the smaller adventure bikes. So the win for this category definitely goes to the mid-size adventure bike. Final thoughts on full-size versus mid-size adventure bike. I think the theme of this whole video has been that they're both amazing choices, and you have to decide which set of compromises or which different set of strengths or weaknesses is right for how you want to ride. Now, I do have a couple parting words of advice before we go. The first is that I highly, highly encourage you to learn how to ride off-road on a dual sport bike or a dirt bike. Learning to ride an off-road terrain on an adventure bike, if you don't have previous off-road experience, is incredibly intimidating and incredibly difficult. And I admire all the people who are attempting to do that. It's going to make your life so much easier in the long run if you get your off-road experience when you're first starting to do that on a much lighter, much lower, easy to maneuver motorcycle. Learn how to skid the bike, learn how to turn it around, learn how to navigate ruts and rocks and hill climbs and going up and down things. Your life is going to be so much better if you can take that approach. If you try to start on an adventure bike as your first off-road experience, I don't recommend it, but that's just my 2 cents. You can take it for what it's worth. Now, if you want me to choose personally what I think is the most versatile overall adventure bike category, it's definitely the mid-size adventure bike. Now, I didn't talk a lot about small adventure bikes in this video because I think they have a bit of a smaller place, at least in the country where I live. I know in other countries the small bikes are very popular. But overall, the mid-size adventure bike, bikes like this T7 or other bikes in this category, I think it's the most versatile type of motorcycle, period. Not just most versatile adventure motorcycle, but I think they're the best overall motorcycles you can buy for the money because they're the jack of all trades. They can do a little bit of everything, and I really, really love them for that. They're not too small, they're not too big, they have enough comfort, enough off-road ability, and they just kind of do everything pretty darn well. Now, with all that said, my last parting words of advice are don't ride a motorcycle that you are really, really scared and intimidated by. So if you identify as that, if that's how you feel, then a few things you can do. Consider getting off-road training, going to different kind of motorcycle rider education courses. Those things can be super valuable. The other thing you can do is, if that intimidation factor is coming because the bike is really tall, really heavy, consider going to a smaller motorcycle, or like I said, getting those off-road skills on something like a dirt bike or a dual sport motorcycle. It's never a good idea to be riding a motorcycle that is so large and heavy that you're just constantly afraid of it. Because when you're operating from that place of fear up here, you're not going to be able to ride well. So that's really, really a problem. So anyway, I hope that this comparison video has had some value for all of you. I hope you found it useful. If it is, there's so many ways you can support the channel, which are all below in the description. Thank you so, so much for watching, and we'll see you out there.